Welcome to this event on the Turkish Kurdish opening. I'm Carol Migdalovitz. I'm from the Congressional Research Service, although anything I may say today in the midst of my esteemed and valuable colleagues will be my own statements and not those of CRS. I would appreciate it if people would please shut off their cell phones, Blackberries, and whatever else might make noise and interrupt the speaker's concentration. Thank you very much. We're going to begin with Kemal, and we're going to be discussing today the Kurdish opening that began with Interior Minister Atalay's speech last summer, suggesting that Turkey was going to be making a democratic initiative. And this was initially directed mainly at its Kurdish population, some 12 to 14 million people, depending upon who you listen to, who have been somewhat disaffected from the central government regime, to put it mildly. And Turkey has fought an insurgency against the Kurdistan Workers' Party, mainly in the southeast, since 1984. The answer all along, people was suggesting that Turkey find a political solution to this problem because it had no military solution. And this may be Turkey's way of finding the political solution, finally. So we're going to start with Kemal Qureshi. Kemal is a professor at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul and visiting at the Transatlantic Academy here at the German Marshall Fund. And he has studied this issue for very many years. And he's going to begin with our program. Kemal.
Thank you. Good morning to you all. This morning, my primary aim is to prove that a Turkish professor, when asked to speak for 8 minutes, can actually manage it. Time will tell.
Don't believe it.
What Henri asked me to do is to very briefly describe what this Kurdish opening and then later on democratic opening as it was returned as a result of domestic politics in Turkey is about. As Carol pointed out, the interior minister, the new with the second AKP government, Beşir Atalay, a professor actually, also served as a rector and was removed from his position by the previous higher education board, announced in July, somewhat out of the blue, that here they had been behind closed doors working on what they call, it was very ironic, though in Turkish it's Türkiye modeli, but when translated into English it becomes the Turkish model for solving the Kurdish problem. That was the first thing that struck me at the time. Now, I'm going to skip the causes behind the Kurdish problem. Carol has very broadly made references to it. Instead, say a very quick few words about what that opening or what that model incorporates. It's still not very clear. It has reached a point where it is to be debated in the parliament. In the first sessions, there were not only words, but some fists flying across the rows there. One of the most important, I think, aspects of this opening from the point of this government is confidence-building measures, the kind of measures that politically do not cost that much and do not require major legal amendments and changes and reforms. Symbolically, from the government's point of view too, one of such first confidence-building measures was the possibility to have not prayers but speeches by the imams in the mosque in Kurdish. And you have to appreciate that this is coming on the heels of the government's decision towards the end of 2008 to start these the TRTs TV program fully in Kurdish, 24 hours, not the way it was initially planned to meet the Copenhagen political criteria. Second one was very much centered around the visit of the president to the city of Tunceli, but historically always known as Dersim. And in that context and in previous visits, in the context of previous visits, it became clear that the government also toyed with the idea of returning the original names of Kurdish towns and maybe villages whose names had been changed at various points in time as part and parcel of the nation-state building exercise. And Dersim is particularly important. It's very symbolic in the traditional Turkish Republican history. Dersim is always considered as a rebellious region, let's say, and a former ambassador of Turkey, Onur Öymen, who serves with the opposition, got himself into considerable trouble because of some remarks he'd made. The second, let's say, leg of this opening was based on the long debated idea of an amnesty for the militants of the PKK or terrorists, whatever you wish to call. The idea is very interesting because the idea was initially brought up by Mehmet Ağar, who was a former chief of police and had his hand in pushing some of the people uphill. If I remember correctly, Henry, correct me if I'm wrong, it was around 2005 or 2006 that he first brought this idea up. And it was interesting the way in which the military hit him back real hard. And 3 years down the line, it was possible to open up the issue and actually implement it to a certain point. Some of you may recollect images from TV broadcasting of a group of PKK people and Kurds from this long-standing refugee camp in just between northern Iraq and proper Iraq called the Mahmur camp, a kind of thorn on the side of Turkey in its relations with the UNHCR for a long time. However, that process has stalled because of the way in which the first batch arrived, and it turned into a big what many in Turkey thought publicity and political show. The third leg, and I think the most difficult one, the most controversial one, is bits that require constitutional changes and amendments. One of them is the redefinition of Turkish citizenship, the wording of the article in the constitution as far as Turkish citizenship goes. This is an issue that has been debated in Turkey for a long time. Its origins go as far back as, I would argue, the 90s. And the point here is to try to come up with a wording that will remove from the perspective of many the emphasis on ethnicity, because the term used is Turk. The defenders of the article have always argued that the term Turk there is a civic term, but others argue, no, it really may have meant to be civic, but the application is more an ethnic one. That's still there standing. A second difficult issue to do with the Constitution is the issue of education in Kurdish in schools. But here, very briefly, there's a big difference between teaching kids the Kurdish language and then running a curriculum in Kurdish, meaning mathematics, and much more complicated, of course, would be history. There is great opposition against the notion of education, running the curriculum in Kurdish. However, reasonable broad support is there for teaching Kurdish at schools, though it would require a constitutional amendment. The last aspect, as far as that goes, is also addressing the issue part and parcel of an exercise to rewrite the Constitution. There was an attempt made at this immediately after the elections in the summer of 2007. However, that ran up against the wall, and it looks like the government is nervous to bring up as big an exercise as this one. And with those remarks, I think I'll just stop there, and would like to think that I did live up to my 8 minutes.
I think you did it very well. Thank you. Henri, so why now?
Thank you, Carl. Actually, Kemal, you did it in 7 minutes, which means I have 9. Why now? Conflict resolution is one of these things that you have to have a constellation of factors that work to your advantage. One thing is not enough, and what we are seeing now is what I believe is for the first time since essentially the early 1990s, to be precise, since 1993, the first real opportunity at resolving this issue in Turkey. The previous one occurred when Turgut Özal was president, and he had succeeded in engineering a ceasefire by the PKK, had sent emissaries, etc. And the atmosphere in the country had changed, but he died, and then there was the murder of 33 soldiers, and the whole thing collapsed. And I think since between 1993 and today, there really hasn't been an opportunity. And why now is because when you look at what's happening is that there's a confluence of factors that come together. And I will list some of them, and they're not in order of importance. But let me also say that I actually believe that this is a very serious effort by this government. Whether or not it will succeed, time will tell. But this, I think, is the most coherent and comprehensive attempt ever made in Turkey on this issue. And it also is signaling somewhat of a change in mentality towards the Kurdish issue, which is actually very significant. Now, let me list for you some of the changes. I guess one of the most important one is the war in Iraq and the American decision now to withdraw from Iraq. The war in Iraq completely upset the apple cart in the region, as most of you know, and most importantly, created and there was already a Kurdish entity in northern Iraq, but it did give rise to the creation of a new Iraqi state in which the northern Iraq is now a federal constituent component of the new Iraqi state, in a way in which it's institutionalized. The Turkish government for many, many years, or Turkish governments, I should say, for many years had tried to find ways of both, ironically, trying to suppress the Kurdish experiment in northern Iraq, yet also at the same time allow American aircraft to fly from Incirlik Air Force Base to protect the Kurds. So there was this dual policy, but it was a policy in which the Turks were not very happy with what was going on in northern Iraq. What we see now, of course, in the last year is essentially a 180-degree change in Turkish policy towards northern Iraq. But this has to do with essentially also some of the other factors I'm going to list, and a different appreciation of what's going on in Iraq. With the American withdrawal from Iraq, Turkey finds itself actually in a very interesting situation where its most important allies or potential allies in Iraq are the Kurds. More than the Shia, more than the Sunni, even though the Turks have tried to work hard and have maintained good relations with all of these different groups. But because the Kurds themselves want better relations with Turkey, this new symbiotic relationship has emerged between northern Iraq and Turkey, and this was culminated only a couple of weeks ago when the Turkish foreign minister went to northern Iraq and announced that a consulate would be open in Erbil. Essentially, this is a way of Turkey saying, yes, we now recognize the federal character of Iraq, and we recognize the KRG, the Kurdistan regional government. So, in part, it is moves that are being taken in Iraq in reaction to the American withdrawal. Similarly, the Iraqi Kurds themselves, facing the main allies' disappearance from Iraq, are also aligning themselves more with the Turks. This creates essentially a new atmosphere in terms of Turkish-Kurdish relations, because the Iraqi-Kurdish issue is intimately related to what happens in Turkey. In this context, the PKK, which has half of its forces in Iraq, half of its forces in Turkey, but its leadership is in northern Iraq in the Kandil Mountains, also is reading the tea leaves and realizes that the Iraqi Kurds do not want them anymore. They have very little tolerance for them, and that somehow the handwriting is on the wall in terms of their presence in northern Iraq. So the PKK itself has now been sending signals in different ways to the Turkish government and the Turkish public that it is looking and seeking some kind of a solution whereby it will demilitarize itself. Of course, it has its conditions, and we can talk about those later. Nonetheless, it is the PKK itself realizes that the time is up for change. The Turkish government in January started conversations within itself as to how it would do this. However, I would argue that work had been going on for much longer, and it took the form essentially of the Turkish head of the Turkish National Intelligence Organization, the TNIO, Emre Taner, who painstakingly, starting in the mid-2000s, began to talk to Iraqi Kurdish leaders. Even when Iraqi Kurdish relations were really bad, Emre Taner was visiting both Talabani and Barzani and trying to come up with some kind of ideas of reconciliation, etc. And this was a very, very important effort, I would argue, because at the time when the PKK had increased its attacks on Turkey and Turkish ire, if you want, against northern Iraq had reached its peak, it was an important confidence-building measure whereby at least the Iraqi Kurdish leadership had access to both the government and the Turkish state at a very, very high level. And in this context, I mean, this happened with the consent of the Turkish military, which I will come to in a minute. Another reason is a new Turkish foreign policy. Turkey, under the Erdogan government, has now been pushing this zero problems with its neighbors, a foreign policy that is multidimensional, and so on and so forth. But one of the components of this is that Turkey wants to become a central power or a major player, and you can't do that if you have a major problem with 20% of your population. So, and when you read some of the writings of the Prime Minister's advisors, etc., there's a very conscious effort at trying to say, look, if we are going to become more important in our region, we also have to solve our domestic problem. And this domestic problem is not going to go away through military means. So this new Turkish foreign policy is also driving this. But fundamentally, I mean, one of the most important changes has taken place in the military. The Turkish military has finally, at least in the person of the current chief of staff, has come to the realization that a military solution is impossible. The chief of staff, İlker Başbuğ, has been having conversations with academics, with journalists, trying to understand, trying to come up with a policy. And what is coming out from the people I've talked to he hasn't contacted me, so I can't say that I know anything directly, but this is second-hand information, is that he's asking essentially very critical questions and admitting that after 25 years of an insurgency, there are as many PKK fighters in the mountains as there were 25 years ago, and then 40,000 people have died in between. So, and billions of dollars have been spent. So what have you gotten? Clearly the military option is not working, and he's looking for new ideas. And this is very critical because without his consent, none of these things would have gone forward. And when you see, for instance, every time the government announces a measure and there's some consternation in public, Başbuğ comes out and says, no, we're here, don't worry, we are behind. I mean, essentially saying we're there, we will protect the state. But also there's something else going on here, and that is, just like, I should say, the PKK also realizes that it doesn't have any military option anymore. And so there's a way in which both sides realize that the armed struggle, so to say, or the counter-terrorist operations will not produce the results necessary. But the other thing that's very important is that the Turkish military has never been as under siege as it is now. A variety of scandals, a variety of much more confidence on the part of the government, self-confidence on the part of the government. Some members of the press corps have put the military for the first time under the microscope. And with the Ergenekon scandals, with the revelations about a number of mishaps that the military was involved in, the tarnish, if you want, of the Turkish military is off. And it is, in that sense, much weaker than it used to be in the past. But also fundamentally, there's another change, and that is that the people in the southeast of Turkey, which have really supplied much of the, shall we say, manpower for the PKK, which have been the most militant parts of the Kurdish community, are also tired of the fighting. They're also tired of the war. I mean, you have to understand that for 25 years there's been sometimes a scorched earth policy. Villages have been destroyed. There's huge numbers of people who have had to move to the cities with no jobs. But also, if you look at what happened after Öcalan's, it's funny how Öcalan has become such a footnote, although he is playing some kind of a role. But between Öcalan's capture, the declaration of a ceasefire by the PKK roughly until 2003, 2004, but even after the fighting restarted, the Southeast has changed. It has changed in the following sense. People are going, whereas they didn't go out at night, there was this fear atmosphere, at least in the cities, life has returned to normal. And people do not want to go back to the bad old days, but they don't also want to give up on what they believe is their rights. So there is also the Kurdish population itself, while being militant at some level, doesn't want to go back to the bad old days of the war. So that's also a factor that's weighing in on the PKK and on Kurdish factors. And the last point here I would make is that the Kurds in Turkey, I believe, are also feeling somewhat more self-confident because of northern Iraq, because that the federal part of Iraq, the Kurdistan regional government, or the Kurdistan region, is now increasingly being recognized. With Taliban as being the president of Iraq, there's much more confidence, self-confidence among the Kurds, and it isn't that they want to join northern Iraq, but they want northern Iraq to be robust. They want northern Iraq to be kind of a place of a haven for them, without necessarily wanting to move there. So there's a way in which the consolidation of northern Iraq has given Turkish Kurds a sense of self-confidence, which is also important in terms of resolving this issue. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. And so, Steve, what does it mean for the United States? What should we be doing or not doing to support this effort?
Thank you, Carol. Before I begin, let me just say that I have the opposite problem from Kemal or Henri. Since I work at the Council on Foreign Relations, I don't think I can talk for more than 8 minutes. So I'll be relatively brief in comparison. I know that Henri and Kemal struggled to meet that. Let me talk broadly about where we are in U.S.-Turkey relations and what we can expect from the visit, and I'll fold the Kurdish opening into that. And let me start out by saying that Prime Minister Erdogan's visit comes at what I think is an awkward moment in U.S.-Turkish relations. There is good news on Iraq, which is something that is deeply appreciated by the administration. The opening to Armenia is obviously something that the Obama administration has been quite supportive of. But there are a range of other issues that have left folks in Washington scratching their heads about Turkish foreign policy. The first and perhaps most prominent one is the continued deterioration of relations between Turkey and Israel. the recent disinvitation from Israel's participation in a NATO air exercise is widely regarded as being gratuitous and unnecessary. This kind of frosty and somewhat hostile reaction to the Israelis has been going on now for about a year. And it's true that Israel has become a big, fat, juicy political target in terms of Turkish domestic politics. But it seems to me that the continued pressure on this relationship is not in Turkey's interests, it's not in Israel's interests, and it's not in the interests of the United States. While Prime Minister Erdogan and the government have been downgrading their relationship with the Israelis, they have been working very hard to upgrade their relations with the Syrians. Now, this is nothing new, and in general, it's a good thing to have Turkish engagement with Damascus, leaving Bashar al-Assad to himself and President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad or Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah is certainly far worse than having the Turks engaging with the Syrians. But at the same time, the Turks are moving in a direction. They have ended the border restrictions, visa requirements for Syrian citizens coming in, and have set the stage for Syrian-Turkish military relations. The TGS isn't terribly happy about this situation. In fact, the asking the Israelis not to take part in Anatolian Eagle was directed more at the TGS than anything else. But if you are a Turkish military officer and you're confronted with no longer being able to train, or the prospect of no longer being able to train with the most powerful military force besides yourself in the region, the most powerful, high-tech, advanced military force, and you're now confronted with having to train and develop links with what is at best a third-rate military establishment, you can't necessarily be terribly happy about it. And then finally, the other head-scratching issue for many with regard to Turkish foreign policy is Turkey's position with regard to Iran. It's one thing for the Turks to say that Iran is a neighbor and that they are supportive of a diplomatic solution to the standoff over Iran's nuclear program, and that even there is an economic exigency for the Turks in order to import Iranian gas, and thus there needs to be good relations between Iran and Turkey. It's quite another thing for the Prime Minister to go to Tehran and make a very good case for Iran's nuclear development. In fact, a better case for Iran's nuclear development than even the Iranian government. Now, when it comes to the issue at hand, the question of the Kurdish opening, I think that the Obama administration is supportive of any steps that Turkey is taking in order to further its transition to a democracy, to the extent that the Kurdish opening consolidates stability in northern Iraq. The administration is going to be supportive of it. But it's clear that this is not an issue that the administration has been focused on. It's generally seen as an internal matter to Turkey, and that if the United States is asked for assistance in some way, shape, or form, the United States will provide what assistance it can. But previously, when American officials have brought up the issue of the situation in the southeast and the Kurdish situation, the Turks have generally said, that's an internal matter. We don't need your help. We will resolve it democratically. And I think that the appropriate position for the United States is the one that it is taking. As terms of the broader agenda of the visit, when Prime Minister Erdogan visits President Obama on the 7th, once we get beyond the diplomatic niceties, what will be on the agenda? And it strikes me that there will be four basic issues on the agenda. AFPAC, which has taken over all of our lives, Iran, Armenia, and the continued development of relations between Ankara and Erbil. As I said, anything that the Turks do to further consolidate the stability in northern Iraq is seen as a plus by the Obama administration. Prime Minister Erdogan and the government come to Washington in a triumphant mood. AKP owns Turkish politics, despite the 9% drop in local elections last spring. The Turkish general staff is generally weak. The opposition is generally hopeless. And they believe, to a large extent, their own press, that Turkey is of vital strategic importance to the United States. And we have, in many ways, enabled that self-perception of Turks. I need not remind you that Secretary Clinton, in her first visit to Turkey, called Turkey an anchor country. The president himself talked about a model partnership. The problem, though, with Turkey's present approach is that while in principle a multidimensional foreign policy, a foreign policy of no problems, a foreign policy that is reaching out to countries in which the Turks have been largely alienated over the course of the previous 4, 5, even 6 decades, is that in some cases it runs directly counter to U.S. interests in the region. And here I'm specifically speaking about the relationship with Iran, but you can also group the relationship with Syria in that as well. The other question is, there's been much discussion of Foreign Minister Davutoglu's ideas emerging from his very large book about Turkey's strategic depth. The question that people have to ask is, strategic depth for what? What is it that Turkey needs strategic depth for? Unlike Pakistan, for example, which you could make an argument might need strategic depth in the event of a crisis with India, or Israel that makes the argument that it needs the West Bank and the Golan Heights for strategic depth in the event of a crisis with its neighbors, it's unclear why Turkey needs strategic depth, and that it makes it unclear why Turkey is rushing headlong into, or seemingly headlong into, a flowering of its relations with Iran. I think that there's an erroneous assumption in Ankara that Turkey can play a role as an interlocutor between the United States and Tehran, that Turkey can be the message carrier between the two countries. I think that it is entirely clear on the other end that the United States is engaged in a negotiation with Iran, that there's very little reason for us to be using intermediaries with the Iranians. Once more, Turkey believes that it can play a big role in the Middle East peace process. As I alluded to before, the deterioration of relations with Israel will likely make that a much more difficult option for them. And something that Henri pointed out a number of months ago to me, which is that Turkey's role in the Middle East peace process during the previous administration seemed outsized. And you could make the erroneous assumption that Turkey was here to play an important role. But with the return of the United States in the Middle East, with a renewed American interest in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian problem, as much as that seems like a fool's errand, and American interest in engaging with the Syrians, by necessity, the Turkish role will likely be reduced. So I think that overall, in looking forward to the visit of Prime Minister Erdogan, the picture of U.S.-Turkey relations are quite mixed. There are things in which it's clear the United States needs to encourage and applaud Ankara for, as I said, the good news on Iraq, the opening to Armenia, which is not necessarily done, and a variety of other things. But there are other issues on the agenda that are disconcerting to American policymakers. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. So now we have discussion. I'll start off here. And so the question is, Kamal, what next? What of this program, to the extent that we understand it, survives Parliament, passes? What after that survives the inevitable court challenge? Will Turkey eventually, in fact, undertake constitutional changes? And will those constitutional changes satisfy the Kurds? Or will the Kurds insist on a federal or confederal solution that the PKK has been pushing, and that they have the role model sitting next door in northern Iraq? These are all interesting challenges, and I was wondering if you want to leap in on any of these questions here. Kamal.
Thanks. I think I would focus on the very last challenge that you made references to. I think one must highlight that only a couple of years ago, I personally would have never thought that we would come this far. However, once that we've come this far, I have come to realize that I agree with the reasons that Henri has listed for why this is happening right now. But I think one very important reason that needs to be added to the list is the process of democratization, that Turkey has changed significantly. I mean, I used to come here 10 years ago, and Amitai is there talking about the Kurdish problem. We're living in two different worlds. But the problem now is that I think there are two fundamentally different understanding of democratization and where this process should go to. The one that I think the government is towing, and I have a sense that by and large a good size of the population or the society in terms of especially civil society, business is going along, is this notion that the issue, the Kurdish problem is addressed in the context of human rights, cultural rights, the rule of law, compensation for the damages that were inflicted to Kurds living in the area. Whereas there's another understanding of democratization, which I think relates to that very last challenge you mentioned, that amongst, I think in the Kurdish political party in the parliament and amongst Kurdish intellectuals, there is the notion that you can have a democratization that emphasizes group rights at a minimum, and if not, even a federal territorial arrangement. Confederal, I know it crosses the minds of some, and there is a long-standing thinking amongst some of the Kurds, the notion of a binational state. But I think political activity in that direction, which is a bit happening, some would argue that what's happened in Izmir very recently with the DTP there is raising the tension. And I do not see, I may be wrong, but I do not see a Turkey that would be capable of even talking about the notion of completely reorganizing the state away from what it has been from the very day that it is born. And unless political actors stay away from that ambition, I think we're going into rough waters, I would say.
Can I do a follow-up question here? There was an interesting article yesterday that sort of observed that the government was launching this and without any discussion with the Kurds themselves, with either the DTP or other representatives of the Turkish Kurdish population. Do you expect this to continue? And what impact would it have on the Turkish Kurdish community not to be consulted or worked with?
I think that depends a lot on how you define discussion. If discussion here means the Prime Minister sitting down with Ahmet Türk, who many people regard is the more moderate and reasonable one to talk to, at a table under the flare of floodlights and TV cameras, yes, that kind of discussion has not taken place. But as Henri pointed out, although I made it sound like the opening came out of the blue, these issues have been discussed in Turkey for a long time, even in the 1990s, and discussed in the sense of civil society members from both sides coming together, MPs in the parliament, knowing each other's backgrounds, have been discussing these issues. Henri again pointed out the military. I think I would shy from saying that somehow the Kurds have not been involved in the formulation of of this, the broad outlines of the opening. Diyarbakir, for example, the Bashir Atalay, I was in Diyarbakir about 3-4 weeks ago talking to the former head of the Bar Association and the former head of the Chamber of Commerce, who's apparently in the meantime become again the head of it. Just as we were sitting in the office and talking about these issues, a phone call came and Bashir Atalay was asking him to come and to present to him his views. And we waited when he came back. We were all curious about what had happened. And he pointed out, as others have said, that the Interior Minister gave him a lot of time and patiently listened to him without interrupting him. And the person I'm referring to is an important personality in Diyarbakir that has an understanding of the first type of democratization, very much emphasizing diversity, cultural rights, the need to move on in terms of economics. So I think the discussion is there, consultations is there, but not of the kind that is in public under TV cameras. And that's what Deniz Baykal, the opposition leader, wants, just to play the role of opposing the exercise for the sake of opposing it.
Thank you. Henri, I noticed in your list of reasons for why now, something was missing, and that is the European Union to some extent. Now, reaching out to the Kurds obviously is not outright a Copenhagen criteria for membership of the EU, although it is part of the democratization of the political process, and it has been brought up in EU progress reports on Turkey over and over again, the issue of the government's treatment of its Kurdish and other ethnic populations. Is it exerting any kind of influence at all on the process, or do you think that Turkey is just ignoring the EU right now for a while? Where does Europe fit in with the whole idea of Turkish democratization right now?
Kyle, I think you know how to cheat, because I wrote that afterwards on my list, and you. No, you're right. I mean, I didn't mention the EU, and I should have mentioned the EU. It's not because I think the EU is irrelevant. It's partially because somehow in the current debate, the EU is not being mentioned. But I would say that EU was a very important catalyst in starting this, because it gave essentially the institutional backbone for democratization, because much of the Copenhagen criteria is about democratization. And even though there is nothing there that says you have to be nice to your Kurdish minority, the fact of the matter is that everybody knows in Turkey that without resolving the Kurdish issue, Turkey has no chance of getting into the EU. It may not have any chance anyway, but the point is, when you think about the process of membership into the EU, assuming that this, if it happens, will happen in 15 to 20 year time frame, this is the EU will look at the Kurdish question only because there's so many Kurds, Turkish Kurds, who already live in Europe. And without resolving the problem, then you are essentially importing the problem. Without Turkey resolving the problem, the EU would be importing it into itself. It has already done so. All you have to do is go to Berlin and see some of the divisions among the Turkish community between Turkish nationalists and Turkish Kurdish nationalists. So the EU is very important. But I also do believe that this is something that is also is internally driven by the government and by this realization that the armed struggle or the counterterrorism operations, the military option, is not viable anymore. And in that sense, I would argue that Caesar has crossed the Rubicon. There is no going back on this Kurdish opening. This is going to be a long process. There's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. And you see it almost on a daily basis. On the one hand, you have the 34 PKK guys coming back from Iraq. There's all this hoopla about it, and then Erdogan makes a very angry speech about it, and then suddenly the atmosphere changes. And then, Bashir Atalay, who, by the way, Kemal and I were talking the other day, this is the interior minister who is so calm, so reasoned in his discussions about the issue. Then comes up and then calms the situation. And if you see the way this has been done so far, and I don't know if this is deliberate, but you find, for instance, a minister or somebody from the AKP dropping a hint. A few weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago now, Cemil Çiçek, who's the Minister of Justice, said, well, 90% of the people, of the PKK guys in Kandil can come back. He said it. Then the debate starts about this. Right? At some point, something was said about, remember whether or not the letters Q, W, X can be introduced into the Turkish alphabet. They dropped that hint, a debate took place on that. So it seems to me, whether this is deliberate or not, I don't know, but that the government is trying to drop these hints, have a discussion, so by the time they announce the whole package or the whole package emerges, some of these issues will have been discussed already now. And that is a way of essentially controlling tensions in society, because this is very difficult. I mean, let's not make any bonds about it. This is an enormously difficult process. And in that sense, the government deserves an enormous amount of credit, because think about this. For 80 plus years, I mean, the official policy was there are no Kurds. There's no Kurdish language. If a Turkish MP when he sends his or she sends his resume to the Turkish parliament to be published in the official document and puts as a foreign language Kurdish in it, they take it out, even to this day. So there's enormous amount of mental, shall we say, distance that has to be covered. But we are at the beginning of this process, and I have to say, I want to point out two things. We are seeing a change in the discourse, and that I think is very important. And when I say change in the discourse, a certain element of empathy is being introduced into discourse. For example, the Prime Minister said the other day something about losing your children in the conflict. Kind of there's a shared pain here. What is equally wonderful, if you want, is that, as Steve pointed out, the opposition is hopeless. I want to bore you with the details, but the number two in the opposition party, as Kemal also said, put his foot in his mouth the other day. But in a way, he did a huge service to the government. What did he do? In reaction to the Prime Minister's talk about losing people, he said, well, in the First World War, mothers also cried because they lost their sons. This was a good thing, because you were defending the country. And he cited a whole series of events, and then included Dersim, or Tunceli. And he basically said what happened in Tunceli, in Dersim in 1937, was legitimate. Well, it was a massacre. This 1937, under Atatürk, the Turkish military did a devastating set of operations to suppress a Kurdish Alevi rebellion. But by bringing it up, he unleashed a whole discussion. And for the first time, Turks are reading in their own press about what happened in Dersim, because this was essentially an issue that was off the discussion table. You couldn't talk about it. Now suddenly it's out in the open. So the change, we have to think of this as a long-term process. It's not going to happen just like that. And let me just finally say this. When you think about the future, in the booklet I did for Carnegie earlier this year, when I was interviewing people about Kurds, what is it that you want? And you're asking independent Kurds, you ask DTP and pro-PKK Kurds, and then you ask Kurds who are in parliament, mostly in the governing party. What was very interesting is that they all said the same three things in the same order. changing the constitution, but in a way that Kemal was talking about, the definition of Turkishness. Not that the constitution will say that this is a country made of Turks and Kurds. No, that the definition of Turkishness will be more inclusive. That will imply that there are more than just Turks in Turkey. Number two, cultural autonomy. By cultural autonomy is having your own television stations, radio stations, newspapers, whatever, without having the state control and censor what you have to say. That includes education, but undefined. Not clear what people want in that. And number three is decentralization of Turkey. Turkey is one of the most centralized countries. I mean, France used to be like that, and the French have made all these reforms, and it's not as centralized. But the Turks, you talk to people. A teacher who is going to go and serve in some remote little village gets appointed by the center. This is like saying, if you want to be a teacher, the Department of Education will send you to Wasilla. I mean, we'll make the decision who teaches in Wasilla and who teaches in Philadelphia.
Good views of Russia, then.
Right, that's true. So you need some decentralization. But that decentralization will not just benefit the Kurdish areas, will benefit every part of Turkey. All right? Even on this issue, Bashir Atalay said the other day, on decentralization, yes, we recognize that localities need more funding to do what they need to do. So we need to think about this. So these are the three things that people want. Whether or not it's going to, I don't think, I agree with Kemal, it's not going to be a federal state, it's not going to be a confederal state, but it's going to become more decentralized. But it's going to be a struggle. And as Carol pointed out, there's the court challenges and the parliamentary challenges, but the Rubicon has been crossed. There is no turning back, because the cost of turning back would be very, very deadly.
Thank you, Henri. I think we have just about a half hour to open it up for the floor for questions. Please try not to speechify. If you speechify, I will cut you off. Joshua.
Thank you. Very quick question. It seems to me that there's been a confluence of interest for the AKP, given that it's become the kind of new democratization movement in the country. And the fact is, if they want to win more votes in Turkey, the easiest way to do that is to go after the Kurdish votes. Now, if they continue on that path and they don't win Kurdish votes, as Steve alluded to, in terms of basically losing the local elections, is this opening going to continue? Is there a point at which the government says this is not in our political interest and they change direction? Is that possible?
I don't think this is about Kurdish votes. This is not about Kurdish votes. The Kurds may still continue voting for the DTP. The AKP gets votes in the Kurdish regions. In the Kurdish regions, there are two political parties, DTP, the Kurdish party, and AKP. The others have absolutely no hope of getting votes. All the other Turkish parties are except for AKP, are essentially regional parties. The AKP is the only national party. I think the AKP's lock on Turkish politics, despite the decline in the local elections, which I believe local elections are also about local issues, is not that significant. AKP will stay at around 45% of the vote for the foreseeable future. They don't have to worry about. This is not about getting to Kurdish votes.
I would dissent a bit from that. I think that AK is a political party, and I don't think they neglect politics in any of their calculations. I don't think they would mind getting more Kurdish votes in the southeast. However, I do believe that the opening is immutable, that it won't stop if they lost votes in the southeast. I think the change is historic and landmark, but I can't possibly believe that a political party doesn't look at the votes. It's impossible for me to believe that. Mike?
I'm Mike Amate, Open Society Institute. I was just wondering, Henri or Kemal or Stephen, if Kirkuk was to undermine the relationship between northern Iraq and Baghdad, would this potentially make Turkey put them in a difficult position to maintain good relations with the KRG?
Let me start by saying that I think that the relationship between Ankara and Erbil is one of the most interesting developments over the course of the last 12, 18 months or so. And I think it's very, very important. But you raise an equally important issue, is what is the durability of this relationship? And some folks have said, well, there's a tremendous amount of economic activity. The Kurds themselves talk about gas and so on and so forth. And I think that all those things are quite important. But I think that there is something called the importance of ideas. And I do think that should the situation in Kirkuk become more difficult and it unravel the relationship between Kurds and the rest of Iraq, it may, let me emphasize, it may have an effect on this new development of these relations between Ankara and Erbil. It is, despite the Kurdish opening, you still have to recognize that long history. It's only recently, as Henri pointed out, that some of these taboos are coming to an end, and they haven't yet been institutionalized. So I think that the situation in northern Iraq remains a wild card for both relations between Kurds and Turks inside of Turkey and Kurds and Turks in northern Iraq.
I jump in a little bit on Kirkuk, if I could. I think what's interesting in Kirkuk is the diminishment of Turkey's concern about the Turkmen, the Iraqi Turkmen, who were, before the war broke out, they were a major concern of the Turkish government, and they were spoken about all the time. So the question then becomes the money from the oil that Kirkuk sits on and what the money is being used for. So I think Turkey will watch and see what works out between the KRG and the Baghdad government on the disposition of the oil wealth and how they work that out. And I think that will play into how Turkey deals with the Kirkuk question in the longer term or the near term, I think, to some extent. There was a gentleman over there with a beard. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Mark Katz from George Mason University. I'd just like to ask anyone on the panel, could you please address the question of what is the priority of Russia for Turkey's foreign policy? I mean, obviously, this is a country which traditionally Turkey has had poor relations going back, to the, very long time. Yet in recent years, the relationship has improved, and yet there are still some tough issues remaining with regard to gas pricing and what does Turkey want in the Caucasus, etc. Just looking at it from the Russian angle, certainly one gets even now a variety of viewpoints in the Russian press, anywhere ranging from Russia and Turkey are privileged, strategic partners, all the way down to Russia and Turkey are primordial enemies. So anyway, thank you.
Sure. I'd say it's as varied in Turkey as it is in Russia. I think that there is obviously this multidimensional foreign policy has driven primarily economic relations between Ankara and Moscow, and I think that the long history of mistrust and distrust between the two countries continues to hamper the development of closer political ties. But then again, Prime Minister Erdogan did look into Vladimir Putin's eyes and saw his soul, and I believe that the Prime Minister said that he admired his Russian counterpart. So I think that there is obviously an interest in developing relations with Russia. There is a segment of elite opinion in Turkey that sees Russia as an alternative to either the EU or the United States, arguing that the EU has engaged in double standards forever and that they're never going to let the Turks in, and the United States is an unreliable ally. And after all, after the invasion of Iraq, although things look better now, the invasion of Iraq damaged Turkey's security. But then again, on the other hand, I think this is my third hand at this point, the war in Georgia certainly freaked the Turks out to see what the Russians were up to in the Caucasus, and that's why they kind of rushed in with their own ideas about the stability of the Caucasus. So I think you're quite right. I think that there is an interest in the development of relations, but there's a whole series of issues that are making that not as fruitful as perhaps some would want it to be.
Thank you, Steve. I think the other thing that should be remembered is the degree to which Turkey is still dependent on Russia for natural gas. there is an economic dependency that's quite extraordinary. I think it's close to 68 or 70% of Turkey's gas still comes from Russia. And that is some of the moving force behind Turkey's outreach to Iran to sort of cut that dependency somewhat. I mean, from all of Davutoglu's talks about all the other reasons why the outreach to Tehran is going on, there is an economic motivation as well. And I think that there's sort of a game being played between the Nabucco and South Stream pipelines. Either one, if South Stream comes through Turkey the way Mr. Putin suggested, it increases Turkey's ties to Moscow and not lessens it the way some thought that Nabucco would. Nabucco was intended to bypass Russia, and here's Turkey cozying up to Russia and getting Russia back in the game. These are all long-term pipelines, and some people don't know whether Nabucco itself will ever really be built. So it's an open question for the longer term. But the economic dimension of this relationship should not ever be overlooked. Kamal, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, please. When one is looking at Russian-Turkish relations from Washington, D.C., or for that matter, relations with Iran and Syria, one thing that is missed out, doesn't enter the map at all, is the huge number of people that are moving across these borders. Just to give you an idea, number of American tourists to Turkey in 2007, I think was around 200,000, 220. The number of people entering Turkey from the ex-Soviet Union was around 5 million. From Russia itself, almost 2 million. And furthermore, Russia for Turkey is not just Russians. I have a student of mine sitting right next to you there. They're people of Tatar origin, Bashkortostan origin, Circassians, and then Central Asia, and there's this unbelievable relationship, very thick relationship, that is not there in the case of U.S. and Turkey. Turkish Airlines, the number of cities that Turkish Airlines is flying into in the Soviet Union or Russia is much more than the number of JFK and Chicago. Turkish Airlines has been dying to fly Dallas, but it can't. It's blocked. So this is a very important point that I think needs to be borne in mind, including relations with Iran.
And I don't think that Russia has weighed in on the Kurdish question, to my knowledge. Do we have any questions to get back to the theme of the panel to some extent, if we could? Sir?
Yeah. What relationship is there between anti-American, Alan Kieswetter from CNO Resources. I think this is probably for Steve Cook. What is the relationship between anti-Americanism that has seemed to be featured in polls in the last few years and constraints it may impose on U.S. relations with Turkey? And is it improving?
Well, if you take one recent poll, I think it was the Pew Global Attitude Survey, there was a demonstrable Obama effect all over the world, with the exception of Palestine, Pakistan, and Turkey. Which does not leave Turkey in a warm, fuzzy group of folks. I think that anti-Americanism in Turkey has not put a constraint on Washington at all. I think that the Obama administration, Turkey is a priority for the Obama administration, and that they are working to rebuild a relationship that, quite honestly, was damaged over the course of the Bush years, primarily because of the invasion of Iraq and the reemergence of PKK violence and the confluence of those two events. To what extent does anti-Americanism put a constraint on what Turkish political actors can do? I think that anti-Americanism is leveraged for domestic political purposes. But very often when I hear somebody complaining about the anti-Americanism of the AKP, you have to look at the opposition as well. And the AKP has clearly demonstrated that it wants good relations with the United States and has done a variety of things in terms of looking towards the United States and trying to repair those relations as well. The The extent to which the AKP, though, runs the table in Turkish politics does not place any kind of real constraint on the government. They don't have to worry about losing any votes. And plus, as I said, they use this issue to their own benefit when it's necessary. All that said, I think it's of extraordinary concern that there seems to be a persistent anti-Americanism in Turkey. There's always been a kind of reservoir of resentment towards the United States. It's a kind of insular, nationalist outlook that has been cultivated over the course of the life of the republic. But at the same time, it seems that we are at levels that are unprecedented, and I think that people are somewhat at a loss how to address that. The president went to Ankara, by all measures gave a very, very strong speech, did, it seems to me, all of the right things while he was in Turkey, yet it hasn't made much of a dent.
One of the things is that the opposition suggests that the Kurdish opening is a great plot of the United States and the West to divide the unitary Turkish state, and that we're behind everything that's going on there. No matter what, we're the grand puppeteer, and we're behind everything that they don't like that's going on with the AKP government. And we're responsible for the AKP government, and therefore responsible for the Kurdish opening. I don't know how you possibly get over that, since it's a mantra that keeps getting played over and over again by the opposition parties. And that feeds a certain aspect of the anti-Americanism that's going on. Henri?
Well, I think there is one, on the Kurdish question, it has had a constraining factor. I mean, and what Carol said about the way the opposition, has portrayed this. And you know that the opposition, which supposedly has all these foreign policy gurus, they know better that this is not an American plan, but they keep repeating it. But it is constraining American policy in the following sense. Notice that we have said absolutely nothing almost on the Kurdish opening as a government. Yet it was an issue that was pushed earlier, especially during the Clinton years, pushed very hard by the Clinton administration. And that something very positive is happening, and the American government is basically saying nothing. And the reason is because they think that if they say something, that it will kind of validate this idea that it is an American plan. But I think that's a mistake. I think no matter what we do, they're gonna say this is an American plan, even if we deny it until we turn blue. They said there are things that the United States can do on this issue that could be very helpful. Part of the change, anyway, in the attitude, especially of the military, was that after the 2007 very successful PKK attacks on Turkish military garrisons, we changed policy. We have now much greater cooperation in terms of real-time intelligence and so on and so forth, according to the press. And so we have helped the process, ironically, maybe inadvertently, by cooperating much more. But we can go essentially further, especially in northern Iraq, in terms of demilitarizing the PKK. One of the things that people, we have to understand the psychology a little bit. The PKK is not going to demilitarize itself and give up its guns to the Turkish military. It will not do it. It will not give up its guns to the Peshmerga, which they think are not a very powerful, serious fighting force. But they would give it back to the American military, which is technically still in control of all of Iraq. So there are ways in which we could engineer and help the process along. But I think we are being held back by this notion that, we don't want to get involved in the mess.
Let me disagree slightly with that. I think that we should, because this is a positive opening, we should follow the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm. And given what we know about the levels of anti-Americanism and the structure of Turkish politics, it's probably prudent for us not to say much and only act when asked for assistance. I don't necessarily think, though, that we're holding back because of anti-Americanism. I think we may be holding back because we don't quite yet really understand exactly what is going on in Turkey with regard to the Kurdish opening. Is this, as Henri pointed out, have we crossed a threshold and there is no going back, or is this kind of one of those periodic movements in a certain direction, something that I think Joshua Walker was alluding to, and then ultimately the hard realities of Turkish politics bring things back to a mean. And I think that the administration is in all likelihood waiting to see exactly what this is, and will act if asked, but otherwise doesn't want to do any harm.
Popular question. Kamal wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think it is probably a topic that deserves a separate gathering and a seminar on it. I agree with most what is being said. There is a structural problem, but let me highlight that anti-Americanism in Turkey very much fluctuates. I remember the Clinton days when Clinton came and visited Turkey after the earthquake. I mean, his popularity was very high. With it, anti-Americanism had come down. Anti-Americanism rose because of what happened right next to Turkey, beyond the structural problems that Steve and Henry are referring to. And the most recent GMF Transatlantic Trend Survey shows that things have picked up in terms of, not as much as it's done elsewhere, but it has. And I would argue that it's very much a function also of how the U.S. administration handles Turkey at maybe the superficial level there. But I do want to get back to my earlier point. Don't think that I have shares in Turkish Airlines. But the more people move between the U.S. and Turkey, I think the more a dent will be made on that anti-Americanism. I saw this happening in the 90s in context of Greece, in the context of the Soviet world, in the context of Iran. And it is beginning to happen in the context of Syria and Turkey. Don't think that there was never anti-Syrianism in Turkey. But the more people interact with each other, the more you begin to dismantle these anti-feelings across borders.
Thank you. Goodness. Gentleman back here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bill Jones with Amnesty International. There's a certain logic the panel developed in relations with Syria and with Iran, but what on earth can explain Erdogan's defense of and embrace of Bashir?
I think I referenced collective head scratching, and I would put the relationship with General Omar Bashir in that category. I think that, in all seriousness, I think that there is a certain amount of Turkish triumphalism about Turkish diplomacy and Turkish foreign policy, and that Africa is actually an area of new interest to the Turks. There's establishment of new Turkish embassies throughout Africa is paving the way for Turkish business and so on and so forth. But it is hard for me. I can make a very eloquent argument for the domestic determinants of Turkey's change in relationship with Israel, economic importance of Iran, the diversification of the gas supplies, why Turkey would be interested in upgrading its relations with Syria. On Sudan, it's extremely, extremely hard to make that case. I will leave that to perhaps Kemal, who has better insight into Prime Minister Erdogan's soul than I do.
I would argue that economic factors do play a role there. There are a number of large companies very close to the government that has stakes in Sudan and wants to expand their stakes in Sudan and beyond Sudan. But I have two very quick points. I'm glad you brought this up. One thing we also need, what pleasantly surprised me, is the reaction that the potential visit of Bashir to the summit of the organization in Turkey that survived. One of the newspapers simply had the headline, "Utanç," embarrassment. And at the end, you saw what happened, and I think that event, from my point of view, is from my perspective, one of the little positive things that have been happening recently. The other point is that I really, in all honesty, I don't want to sound like the lawyer of the Prime Minister himself. I have issues of difference with him on many issues. It's been distorted in the American press. He did not say that Muslims do not commit genocide. He said soykırım yapamaz, not yapmaz. Yapamaz is should not. It's difficult to translate it in. And I think the media needs to take some responsibility on that. And it got distorted and it keeps being repeated, I've seen in many columns in many serious newspapers.
Be that as it may, Kemal, it is the optics of this, whether you translate it as precisely as you do, which is correct, or the way in which it's been repeated, the optics of this is not very good. I think embarrassment is appropriate. Just as Turkey is grappling with its own history of the early 20th century and obviously has a problem with this question of the G word, the sense that the Turkish government is interested in developing a closer relationship with the Sudanese is of, I think, should be of tremendous concern.
And this,
Can I say something?
Whether the commercial, the commercial exigencies are there or not.
there's also people in this town who do believe that the Prime Minister has his blinders on with regard to the more nefarious Islamic governments that may exist, that he refuses to see their dark sides, and that he was more willing to see the dark sides of perhaps governments in the West. Maybe we'll take a final round of several questions at once, and then we'll have to end the panel. Over here, please. Go ahead. You.
Yurter Özcan with the Washington Institute. I just want to get back to the whole public opinion and the Kurdish opening in Turkey. I know Henry mentioned that AKP is still strong, but any of the recent surveys that I've seen in Turkey, I've seen AKP votes anywhere between 31 and 37%. And as hopeless as they may be, CHP and MHP are the only parties whose votes and whose popularities have been rising. I think it's important not to ignore the strong Turkish sentiment against the Kurdish opening and how it may reflect in the next general elections in Turkey.
Yeah. Look, first of all, I never believed Turkish opinion polls. They have turned out to be wrong time after time after time. All you have to do is look at the 2007 elections. Everybody was shocked by the results that emerged. So I think at this stage, I don't think those opinion polls are material. Second, I would also argue that if the opening proceeds and there is much greater calm and you see the beginning of the dissolution of the PKK, it's going to be a major winner for the AKP everywhere in the country, I believe. So it's not, you're beginning at the beginning of a process. This is the most tense periods of any, but you have to take a longer term view.
Miss.
Hi, Daphne McCurdy from SIPE. Going off of that same point, I wanted to go back to the AK Party and Kurdish votes. Given the recent tensions between CHP and Alevi Kurds, do you think the AK Party can capitalize on this, given that the Alevis are known to be staunchly secular?
I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, I think what happened when the deputy party chief, Onur Ermen, made those comments about Dersim, I think he opened an enormous wound in the party, an enormous schism, which we have yet to see how it's going to play itself out. And let me also say that the government is also have on its plate an opening towards the Alevis. So they consciously also are trying to deepen the schism that already exists within the party.
Sorry, Karen.
Go ahead.
You're the boss.
No, go ahead.
Just to add to it, let's not forget that it was an AKP minister, interestingly of JHP origin, that actually apologized to the Alevis. And the notion of apology in Turkish politics had not existed until then.
I would dissent a little bit. I'm not quite sure AK can play to the Alevis in the longer term. I think this may be a short-term development that AK, unless it really does something more like something for the Cemevi or something beyond the rhetoric, actual action that on the agenda that the Alevis have. I don't think AK can exploit it in the longer term, and I don't see them willing to make the concrete actions to appeal to the Alevi in the longer term. One more question.
The tax on rakı, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Sir, back here.
Dr. Barkey, you said earlier that Minister Davutoglu's visit to Erbil and the announcement of the opening of a consulate there was a sort of recognition of the KRG. I would ask you to maybe explain that a little more and maybe talk about the contrast between formal and informal relations between Ankara and Erbil. Because my understanding was that Davutoglu on that visit specifically said that this was not a recognition of the KRG and that he traveled with ministers from Baghdad and that Ankara has tried to maintain a closer relationship to Baghdad than to Erbil, and they are much closer to Talabani than Barzani and so on, and that they're still trying to distance themselves from any sort of formal recognition of the KRG's existence.
Could I just leap in a little bit here? Legally, you recognize the government of a country and not a regional government. Nobody recognizes internationally the government of the District of Columbia, where you recognize the capital of the United States. But that being said, I'll let Henri leap in here.
Look, I think it's very symbolic. The opening of a consulate in Erbil, considering that among the nationalist circles in Turkey, some of which are also included in the AKP, was a tremendous kind of betrayal of the Turkoman cause or the Turkmen cause. If you open up a consulate in the capital of the KRG, what does it say? I mean, the KRG is not, as Carol pointed out, is not an independent state, right? But it is a constituent member of a federal state in which there are only two constituent parts, the KRG and the rest of Iraq. So effectively, you're saying that we're going to have dealings with them on a government, literally on a government-to-government level, because what will the Consul General in Erbil do? He's not, or she is not going to be talking through Baghdad to the, let's say, the Barham Saleh government that exists now in northern Iraq. They will talk directly. That's one. Number two, you have the amount of commercial activity between northern Iraq and Turkey is very, very significant. Number three goes back to Mike's question about also Kirkuk. There's a way in which, by opening a consulate in Erbil, what the Turkish government is also signaling to the Kurds is that we are no longer in the following the policy of trying to deny that the KRG never existed. Right? So in that sense, it's a major shift, because until then, the previous Turkish official policy was to kind of say Iraq should be a unitary state. It's better if it's not a federal state. There was a certain amount of opposition to the notion of federal state. This is a recognition of federalism, and in that sense, it's very, very, very symbolic and very, very important. And yes, the foreign minister may have to say all these things to placate domestic public opinion by saying that we're not recognizing the KRG. It's true, they're not recognizing KRG. They're recognizing the federal nature of the Iraqi state. Right? And maybe tomorrow, if there's a federal Anbar state, let's say, they may open a consulate there too. Right? But it is.
The consulate significance will become much more conspicuous when, I suspect, in a very short time, the Turkish government is going to lift visa requirements for land crossings. And then what is a consulate going to do, basically, there?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, gentlemen, all, for your participation. We appreciate it very much.